Spot me. Hello, here at last. Thank you very much for coming and for also sticking around. I'm going to jump straight in. I'm Rex. I'm one half of Foam Sword. That is a very early placeholder graphic that we should probably change at some point. But and we are a little game-making collaboration between myself and my friend Moo, who is sitting, there he is, down at the front. And we first worked together at Media Molecule on LittleBigPlanet, which was like over a decade ago. And we've done separate things over the years, but then we got back together again a little while back to make a new thing called Knights and Bikes. And Moo works on the tech side of things, areas like AI, online multiplayer, as well as the more hardcore elements like combat. And also creating like all the little script components that the game is made of, like hundreds of little individual building blocks that then I take and try and wire together to build out scenes and then build out levels. And I draw on my background in design and art and animation to build out the world, design levels, create a story to pull you through it, and trying to make it look nice as well. And we're also very lucky to have Kenny on board, who was audio director at Media Molecule back in the day, and then also another friend, Dan, who is working on the score. He most recently did the score for some little art house film called Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I don't know, you've probably not heard of that, but hopefully it will, it will blow up one day. And we also partnered up with our friends at Double Fine. So, what I really want to convey with this talk is that when you're creating the visual style and tone of the game, it's not just about how it looks, but also more about why it looks like that. You really want to have a strong link between, how it looks and what the game is about. So it's not just a filter that could be swapped out for another one, but that tone really inspires the style, and the style inspires the tone. The most important lesson I ever learnt at art college, which probably won't work quite so well with me stood at the back of the screen. Imagine I'm that chair, there's always better artists. There's far more talented artists that way better than me at drawing hands, at drawing feet, and particularly drawing horses. But the most important thing is to be working out what to do with your skills as an artist, and how to steer projects so that they play to your strengths, and making sure that you're soaking up the world, honing your taste from the influences that inspire you. But also adding something of yourself as well, so you're not just repeating what's gone before. There's a little look at Knights and Bikes. We've got the sort of high-level stuff out of the way. What have we actually been making? So this is Knights and Bikes is an action-adventure about two girls cycling around a Cornish island in the 1980s, looking for a legendary lost treasure. And this is an early trailer that we did when we kickstarted the game, featuring some folks like shouting about the things that they liked about it.
Yes!
Geese, puffins,
Puddles,
Lances!
treasure,
Friends.
Games!
fun,
Danger.
Knights!
and
bikes.
So, Knights and Bikes, the main themes of the game are childhood, friendship, exploration, and imagination. Or more specifically, it's about bunking off school with your new best friend, jumping on your bikes, to go hunting for a legendary lost treasure that might or might not exist, might have just been invented for the tourists that are coming to this island. You're filling up your pockets full of the kind of everyday loot that kids love to collect, worms and water balloons and owl pellets and all of that stuff. And it's all in a coming-of-age adventure that really bumps up against the reality of the adult world around you. So there's some trouble in this kind of childhood paradise. But at least, let's just go back one. But at least throughout this story, you have each other. There's Nessa and Demelza, and you've also got your pet goose, Captain Honkers. So how on earth did we end up with all of this? What was the origin of the project? Well, a great advantage of making something on a small scale is that you can really, put a lot of yourself in it. And right from the start, it was going to be a very personal project, a very small-scale collaboration between me and Moo. And it needed to be easy to create the assets. There's a lot of content to make, and we needed to use off-the-shelf tools like Photoshop and Unity. And to pay for the production, we used crowdfunding. And to get instant attention, we needed to build it around some pop culture touchstones like the Goonies, but also make it its own thing. And this theme suggested it would be a game world explored by child characters with lots of energy and wild imaginations, but there was a question of what kind of setting they'd be exploring. Well, straight off, it's drawn a lot from the environment that I grew up in, which was a Cornish sheep farm and the surrounding countryside. As a child, I really enjoyed exploring the farm, talking to the animals, building bases, making up stories, imagining all kinds of fantastical elements that were kind of, there, but not there. But unfortunately, I got ill, and I couldn't go outside anymore. Luckily, I'd built up a flock of sheep of my own, which I'd loved and cared for, but I couldn't anymore. So the sheep, they got sold. That might be why I'm a vegetarian now. And I bought a computer. I know what you're thinking. It's not me, honest. And it was an Amiga 500 computer, the best computer ever designed. There's Andy Warhol using one to paint Debbie Harry. And I used this technology to make really bad games. Although I was missing the outdoors, weirdly, I guess it was because it was the 90s, I just wanted to make cyberpunk games. But luckily, after 20-odd years, I've wanted to get back to making stuff more about something that you can actually add something to yourself. And therefore, the themes of Knights and Bikes are based more around growing up on that Cornish sheep farm. So there's, that's where I grew up in Cornwall, and then, bringing a lot of influence from that rural location, but then with some pop culture references from West Coast USA, where Moo grew up, right in the shadow of Disneyland. And one of the sub-themes of the game is the tussle between the very beautiful natural countryside with the more commercial influences of like theme parks and tourist traps and all of those kind of things that are drawing in more visitors, but also helping the struggling economy. So focusing on the Cornish influence, it's a very rural area to get inspired by, with rugged coastline, fishing villages. It's also famous for King Arthur, and even more famous for his big breakfasts. It's a place of magic and fantasy, but it's also one of the poorest regions in Europe, which has a big impact on the look and themes of the game, as it's all set in an area that was once industrial, but mostly has to rely on tourism now. And this is the backdrop that inspired the game. That's the first ever page of my sketchbook from the project, which, a sketchbook is really where I like to start everything and really continue through development. So you can sort of see a bit of my sketchbook in the background, and I treat it very much like a journal, a way of like externalizing problems and then returning to them later. And spending time in a sketchbook really gives you some space to have ideas away from the digital tools. I think it gives you a different kind of thinking than when you actually, you're in front of the computer. And then when you are in front of the computer, then you get, you build, because you've got a certain tool set, you can you can get inspired by the tools that you have in front of you. So you come up with a very different set of ideas. But basically, I think it's just important to do lots of thinking on paper so that you can be quite loose and flexible when you're actually on the computer, but you still have something to guide you, so you're not just fiddling around in the software forever. And then, once all those sketches have been reinterpreted and brought into the game, that's how the game looks. It's technically thousands of little paintings that you can walk in front of, or behind, or through. Here's a little behind the scenes, showing just how paper thin it is. And in some ways, it's quite a fast way to build up an environment, but it's also quite painstaking, as you often hit the limits of the technique. But when I hit those limits, I try to exaggerate the issue, make a feature of it, or more often than not, try and create something that really distracts you from it, and maybe even remove things that just won't fit. So I'm going to go into detail on that, how the art style came about and how painstaking it is. But bear in mind, this is actually how I I'm getting there. How I actually solve most design problems. Problem, solution. Cover it up. So there's a lot of that going on all the time. Okay, so by hiding the problem areas and layering up a lot of the art, it starts to become more of a believable 80s rural setting of the game. Caravan parks, fishing villages, plenty of countryside to explore in between. And although it's in an 80s setting, it's, you can see it's not exactly Miami Vice. It's a pretty rundown place. But this sense of semi-abandonment aims to create a playground for our players and the characters they inhabit. We want to make sure that the player has lots of space to play out their own fantasies. And as the story takes place at the end of the tourist season on the island, the visitors have all gone home, and the local adults are busy preparing for winter, so it's really like a kid kingdom to explore. The adults are just too busy to be out, searching around as well. And a strong influence on the look of the game world came from the art of Alfred Wallace, who was a Cornish fisherman, who then became a painter. And he had no formal training. And it's got a link. It's got a link with, he was painting the same regions that we're trying to recreate. So there's a link there. But also, because they're so naive, these compositions kind of made me more confident to really play with that fakery of a 3D environment made out of 2D assets, and just show a little bit of progress through the game. Like early on, it was just too conservative, like painting everything like straight on, without any perspective. But it just felt really bland. There was no depth to it whatsoever. I was really worried that by adding any perspective, it would actually break the 2D, 3D illusion, and then started to add on some side pieces and gave it a little bit more depth. But actually, by the final phase, kind of realized that you could be quite expressive and quite creative and add all sorts of crazy angles. And because you're trying to represent a Cornish fishing village with all the cottages all tumbling over and what have you, it actually became a more accurate way to depict those scenes. And this really led to I'm on the only creaky floorboard in this whole room. And this led to the real key of the visual style, which was to represent how the kids in the game might try and depict it themselves. If you gave them a bunch of materials, how would they tell this story to you? How would they depict it? So as you play, you hopefully feel like you're seeing the world through their eyes, and at least getting some sense of the imagination and energy that the kids have in the game. So basically, it all looks a little bit fuzzy, a little bit scribbly. There's a big self-imposed limitation on the art style, which is to paint everything in 2 brushes, like a big soft one for the more natural elements, and then like a harder edged one for just picking out details, really. You see a few assets. There's boats and car seats and what have you. And although everything is quite different, just having those two brushes really unifies everything together because they're all going to be, composed in scenes and like reused many times. So having that real strong look just enables everything to sit together. More. A little bit of live painting. I'm not actually doing this back here. This is a video. Colouring in an eyeball. And then using a softer brush to add a bit of extra detail, some shading. A little double chin on there. And a lot of the characters are designed in vector art initially, just because it's easier to get those bold shapes and really sort of like quite graphic style. And then they get repainted in the two brushes to unify it all and make it a little bit less clean. And then there's the final version on the right with a little bit more refinement, a bit more detail, and maybe a little bit of animation. Talking of animation, everything in the game really needs to convey that energy of childhood and the way that kids are like constantly shifting attention. So wherever possible, we redraw everything 3 times to give it that sort of stop motion line boil look. Keep everything moving, keep your eyes excited. Suggest there's no like one set way to look at anything. See some more examples there. Some of the characters. And then that really helps where we can actually, this line boil style is a useful way of showing the kids' imagination coming into the world. So here you've got like a car crusher in a scrapyard, and then as they're running around, because that, things get fed into that car crusher and they come out the other end, they're kind of imagining it as a dragon. And with the hand-drawn style, it means that those, that painted layer can look like it's both part of the world and also be quite distinct from it as well. And influence on that was this amazing cartoon. Don't know if anyone else here is old enough to remember it, but Rhubarb and Custard by Bob Godfrey. And that was a real inspiration on me, just the way that the lines are always moving. But also, like, that's it without audio. Like, that's the best music ever. And that really captures like some of the energy of the game as well. And I just kind of added that in there to say that influences on visuals don't have to just be visual. When I'm working, a lot of influences come from audio. It's really great to investigate other visual styles and techniques, but it can really be quite overwhelming sometimes. And when I'm knuckling down on a project, I need to stay inspired. I find audio is one of the most useful sources for this. Something that's a particular influence on the game has been the poetry of Dylan Thomas and Under Milkwood, which I'm just going to play a little bit.
It is spring, moonless night in the small town, starless and Bible black. The cobbled streets silent and the hunched quarters and rabbits wood limping invisible down to the slow black, crow black, fishing boat bobbing sea. The houses are blind as moles, though moles see fine tonight in the snouting velvet dingles, or blind as Captain Cat, there in the muffled middle by the pump and the town clock, the shops in mourning, the welfare hall in widow's weeds, and all the people of the lulled and dumbfound town are sleeping now.
Wow, so good. So much imagery, that pops into your head while you're listening to that. And, it's kind of up to you how you want to interpret those visions that it creates. I find that actually far more inspiring, really, than like looking at photos of a seaside village. And as I was saying earlier, we're working with our friend Kenny, who's a great collaborator on the project, and Kenny is bringing in his influence as well, and he loves old sound equipment of creating that warm and imperfect sound from like old 80s technology. So I'm going to let him explain for a second in his own words. Oh, here we are. Yes?
Another way that I've tried to pay homage to the 1980s is by bouncing all the audio in the trailer to cassette tape, that wonderful steampunk technology we had when I was a kid. So for Daniel's music, I gave that the 5-star treatment, and I bounced that to a Type 4 metal cassette. And then, but with the sound, I was a little bit rougher. I put it onto a much cheaper tape, bought off of eBay. And that is like 4 generations old. It's been bounced to tape 4 times to just really try and munge the sound up a bit. So here's an A/B comparison between the original kind of pristine digital version of the trailer and now the cassette tape version. Which is pretty subtle stuff, even by my standards. You can hear a subtle warbling in the high end, but it's not quite as wonky as I remember cassette tape being. So I've got a little bit of R&D and homework to do there to really try and push that and bring back that sound that I'm familiar with. But I'm looking forward to going deeper into that and doing some of that work.
So I have to say, I can't actually tell the difference between those 2 audio files either, don't worry. But, you know, I think, you know, trying to bring that level of care into the audio, you know, into all aspects of the game is really important to us on our tiny little team. And this old technology brings me on to, like, the final area I really wanted to touch on, which is nostalgia. Thanks, He-Man. And although it's a very highly flavoured game, you know, I've been banging on about Cornish farms and what have you, we really can't overlook how much nostalgia has helped us. I doubt that we would have gotten this far, you know, in terms of funding and what have you, without tapping into the wider shared experiences of pop culture. The retro elements really do, you know, they bring people in, they get other players on board before they then find out about some of the more unique aspects of the game. Yep, that's what I just said. And the 80s setting is a really popular one, as most things that we have now existed in some form in the 80s, but we can see them in a different way. You know, mobile phones kind of existed. You know, I wouldn't call them mobile, but they did exist in some form. The internet existed as teletext on your TV. Netflix existed in your local video library. Spotify came on cassette tapes. So, you know, even if you weren't alive in the 80s, as I'm sure lots of you, you know, probably weren't, it's still not that hard to connect with this time period. You know, it holds a bit of a mirror up to our own. So here's one specific example that we have a sort of He-Man type character who he's got his own franchise within the game world. He's got his video cassettes and toy figures, and they're ones that you can then use to have little mock battles. You can see Nesta and Demelza currently like duking it out with a little He-Man figure. I mean, Prince Castleman figure. But it's also been a deliberate choice not to go super 80s, because I think there's a lot of like nostalgia culture that makes out that on the 1st of January 1980, like everyone jumped in their DeLorean and then like drove around in a neon sunset, and that really wasn't what happened. You have to have money to keep up with all the latest trends, and as the game's set in an economically challenged remote region, the 1980s influence is a bit more nuanced. So essentially, it's the nostalgia in the game is more like finding old family, you know, old Polaroid photos of family holidays than it is about a mass media depiction of the past. And hopefully the ways that it tries to differ will make it more fresh and surprising when someone's actually playing. So, you know, although you do get to play a mini game with some He-Man figures, you also get to play a mini game where you learn how to correctly fill a jam scone. And it is jam then cream. Don't at me. But one of my favorite things about a little sprinkling of nostalgia, but not laying it on too thickly, is that it creates a space for little moments of storytelling between your players. As the game is played as co-op, we want our players to talk to each other. And sometimes that's going to be while solving a puzzle or celebrating winning a battle. But it's nice if the game world and the themes can get players talking, and discussing what they're experiencing. So, a key element of the game is bikes, and everyone has such cool stories, such interesting, emotional stories about their first ever bike. It's the first time you get a taste of independence, and it's also something to show off to your friends. When we're building the spaces for the to show off the game, like at booths and things like this, we really try and double down on that. We took a little bit of a break at Rezzed this time. Our booth's a little bit simpler because we nearly killed ourselves doing this one, which we just basically built a whole kid's bedroom from the 80s with a bunk bed and all sorts of stuff. But it really welcomes players into the game, and as they sit down in the space, they're starting to remember certain stories from their past, and creating sort of more universal experiences and memories. We haven't actually ported it to a SNES yet. That is just a sticker. The videotapes. And because it's a co-op game, so it's interesting just hearing the stories that are created between maybe a kid is playing the game, but they're co-oping it with their parents, and and although the kid just wants to run through the world and hit things and jump on a bike and what have you, it's their parent that is getting all nostalgic about some of the things from their childhood, and we hear all kinds of little conversations about getting excited about VHS tapes or things from their past. That sort of sharing, they share the fantasy and then augment reality with their own shared imaginations, as the mum and son are doing here. Looks like Dad's probably pretty into it as well. So that's been a bit of a blast through a lot of aspects on the project to try and create the world, story, and game that's accessible but highly flavored and quite esoteric. Working in sketchbooks out in the world has generated one type of ideas, and then working with digital tools to create a different set of ideas. Pulling in personal stories and influences, but also having some pop culture elements to keep it relatable. Going for a deliberately limited art style to make it cohesive and make that style mean something outside of the visuals. And that in turn has influenced the gameplay, allowing the imaginations of the kids to draw onto the world and change it. And taking lots of inspiration from audio while working, whether that's spoken word, custom music playlists, or the actual audio of the game. And really recognizing the power of nostalgia, but not getting too lost in it, listening to people's personal stories and creating space within the game and outside of it for them to share them with each other. And yeah, I think I've covered all those now. I can't actually read them from back here, so hopefully. And I just wanted to say one last thing, which is I'm just going to finish off with a poster from an actual death metal festival, as you do, with all the bands and their logos. Hopefully it's going up here. There it is. And I just want to say, when creating a game, try and be party canon. Be yourself, make interesting choices, enjoy what you do, soak up the world, subvert what's being overused, and be a party canon in this industry. Ooh. Thanks. Thank you. Sorry, it's all been a bit weird with me back here, but...